What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit different because I need something simple to shoot. My house went as a house to another house down at the beach. We were still socially distanced from the world. We weren't going to bars or anything like that, but we just wanted to kind of get out of this house and go hang somewhere else, and we did, and it poured rain the whole time, and that's okay. I recently was tagged in a challenge on Instagram by my buddy Ward over at Whiskey Jam, and in the challenge you were supposed to name 10 albums that shaped your musical taste, and you weren't supposed to elaborate, just post the album covers. But a bunch of people said, hey, I'd love to hear you talk more about some of these albums, and so that's what today's video is going to be. It's going to be the albums that shaped my musical taste, and they're not all going to be country albums. I'm going to do more than 10, I'm going to do 20, and I'm going to talk about them very, very briefly each time, and sort of how each one did shift my perspective or why it was especially meaningful to me. These are in no particular order, and let's just get started. The first one that came to mind most immediately is Emotionalism by the Avett Brothers. She's fighting with the sky. She thinks she can. Emotionalism is probably my all-time favorite album. It just holds a lot of personal meaning for me. It reminds me of my freshman year of college, my very first weekend of college, standing in a bar with big X's on my hands, seeing this band, I didn't know who they were, the Avett Brothers, in a little room of like 250 people at a venue that doesn't even exist anymore. And all I remember from that concert was just A, feeling awkward because I'd never been in a bar, and B, loving the song Die, Die, Die. And as I dove further into their music over the course of the year, I loved the way they mixed kind of bluegrassy country instrumentation with a punk rock attitude, and they sang about shame. They sang about being hard on themselves, but also there was a hope kind of imbued in their music about them wanting to be better men. I think that runs all the way through the Avett Brothers music, even as they become fathers and are much more mature now. I love them. They're just kind of my soul band. Then I want to mention, now that's what I call music. There's no volume number either. My very first album that I unwrapped from my stocking was the original Now, and it had songs by like the Spice Girls and Janet Jackson and Casey and JoJo. But I think that album shaped my taste by kind of contributing to a populism that is present in the way that I look at music. I'm interested in what's the most popular stuff, and that's naturally my personality, but it's also the fact that from the very beginning of my musical collection, I was looking at songs that were charting really, really well and finding that an interesting way to categorize music. And also, I remember being scandalized by the song Sex and Candy that was at the end of that album. I smell sex and candy here. Then I'd say Relient K's Anatomy of the Tongue-in-Cheek. Relient K was this pop-punk Christian band that I loved in middle school, even into the beginning of high school. They're on here because, A, I loved that sound of music. Everyone from Sum 41 to All American Rejects to Blink-182 to Simple Plan to SR-71, I loved that kind of era of fizzy, poppy, punk music. But moreover, they're on here because they were the first band I ever felt ahead of the curve on. And that feeling of being a fan that was on a band early is so satisfying that to this day, I still follow Relient K. I will still listen to their new album, even though they've had so much turnover as a band, their styles have changed, but Matthew Thiessen remains an incredible songwriter. I will always listen to their albums on the day they come out just because I liked that feeling of being ahead of the curve. And when I was into Sadie Hawkins' Dance on that album, it was like 2 years before everyone else was into that, and I liked that feeling. Now, staying on the subject of firsts, I want to mention Weird Al's Bad Hair Day. We've been spending most our lives living in an Amish paradise. And I'm mentioning this because my very first concert was actually Weird Al. Yes, the parody master himself. I saw him in concert with my buddy Alex at King's Dominion. I watched him sing songs such as Like a Surgeon or Fat, and I saw him play the accordion while wearing a comb bra and hopping around the stage with one foot behind his head. I think Weird Al is hilarious. Listening to him as a kid is what gave me such an intense love of wordplay, and songs on that album like Everything You Know Is Wrong gave me a taste for a sort of punny type of songwriting, which has very much shaped the type of country music I like too. Next album is Randy Travis's Old 8x10. My love is deeper than the holler. This is here because Deeper Than the Holler, which is included on this album, was the first country song I remember hearing, and it remains to this day one of my very favorite songs of all time. I've talked about this on the channel before. My dad went through a country phase when I was really little, and I remember hearing all kinds of songs like Honky Tonk Moon and Deeper Than the Holler in his station wagon coming back from soccer practice or when I was just getting picked up from daycare. And although I would say my taste was much more poppy for middle school and a lot of high school and even going into college, that country love came back around, especially when I was in college and then into my adult life. And Randy Travis was absolutely one of the main reasons why. Another one in that same vein would be Garth Brooks' No Fences.
Blame it all on my roots. I showed up in boots and ruined your black tie.
Garth Brooks is someone that people think I kind of don't like that much just because I said I thought maybe Eric Church or Carrie Underwood should get Entertainer of the Year, and also I like to include the clip of his first Facebook video on the channel.
But I'm already finding out on my own, so it's wiping the walls out between you and me, and I really like that.
But I for real love Garth Brooks, and No Fences is one of my favorite albums ever, specifically for the two songs Friends in Low Places, which is just a jam, and also for Unanswered Prayers, which is the first time I really remember being surprised by a lyric. The twist that happens in the first chorus of "Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers," and you realize he's not with the girl that he's pining away for. I just remember being shocked by that as a little kid. And then later on when I started hearing other country songs that have kind of a big twist, whether it's "Don't Take the Girl" or "He Stopped Loving Her Today," I kind of had a flavor for it already. And while we're in my dad's car, I gotta mention the compilation cassette tape, Pure Funk. So if you've seen the video with my parents, you know my dad was a funk DJ in college, and man, I just remember hearing songs like Brick House by the Commodores or Shining Star by Earth, Wind & Fire from this album. And although at the time I would have just said, oh, these are oldies that my dad likes, I think in hindsight, this album actually has been important for my musical framework in reminding me when I'm getting a little too serious about music that ultimately, it's about having a good time. Ultimately, music is fun, and when you see people go to concerts and kind of go out to bars in downtown Nashville and you can start to overthink things, be like, this music's too shallow, or they just make dance songs, it's nice to remember music's supposed to be fun. Although it is kind of funny in hindsight that my dad was so into funk and I became a country fan. We don't fully understand it either. I'm gonna pair two albums together for the next part, and it's gonna be Shaggy's Hot Shot and Eiffel 65's Europop. I'm putting these together because these are the first two albums I remember ever feeling disappointed by, and I was probably only 11 when I heard both of them, but they're also the first two albums I ever bought with my own money. I remember being really pumped. I'd gotten like a $10 Barnes & Noble gift card, and I'd also saved like 20 bucks of my own, and so I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought these albums because I liked the song Blue Dabba Dee. I'm blue dabba dee dabba die. And I liked the song Angel. Girl, you're my angel, you're my darling. And listening to both albums, I remember feeling disappointed by them. And I was like, geez, that sucks. These are kind of shallow and there's not much to these guys. They don't have much to say. Even when I was 11, I guess I was a little bit of a snob. Up next is Toby Keith's Unleashed. Hey, Uncle Sam, put your name at the top of his list. This was the first country album that I really found and pursued and enjoyed on my own, separate from my parents or anyone else in my life. Although now my perspective on international diplomacy is a lot more nuanced, when I was 12 years old in the wake of 9/11 and I heard Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue, and Toby Keith was just kind of like, you hit us, we're gonna put a boot in your ass. That kind of visceral anger just made a lot of sense to me, and it drew me to this album. I enjoyed Toby Keith's irreverent bravado and the humor and the twang in his music. I do love how that sound of this album is, and I really loved when he pulled it back and sang songs like Huckleberry. I think a lot of it's kind of stupid in hindsight. I wouldn't like it as much, but it was absolutely one of my gateways into country music. And I think it's cool that your taste can change, but you can still say, hey, maybe it was Cruise by Florida Georgia Line, or maybe it was even Old Town Road that brought someone into country. I have more imagination for that these days. On the flip side, let's talk about Jason Isbell's Southeastern. And I've grown tired of traveling alone. This album is super significant for me because it is what kind of red-pilled me into the world of independent country. I was working at Entertainment Weekly. At the time, I'd kind of become the de facto country writer on staff. I was covering the mainstream and writing about like Jason Aldean and Carrie Underwood, and that's all well and good. I still enjoy covering those people, but then I heard this album, Southeastern, and it was so raw and so real with songs like Elephant and Traveling Alone. He's singing about his sobriety and he's singing about himself, and it was produced in Nashville, and it opened my eyes to the world of independent country, which then showed me, wow, there's a whole world of Americana, and there's a whole world of red dirt, and there's a whole world of so many country musicians that aren't in the country radio landscape. And I'm so thankful for that. It completely transformed my taste. And better yet, this album was selling really well. And I was like, wow, there's a big audience of people that don't necessarily like the public identity of what country music is, but love this sort of music. And even though that narrative might feel old hat to you or me, I still think for a lot of people out there in the world, that's really new information. And so I try to remember how it felt when I heard Southeastern by Jason Isbell, and remember that someone listening to Zach Bryan or someone listening to Jamie Wyatt or American Aquarium, they might be having that exact same reaction when they hear those albums, and that's really cool. Let's hop back to middle school for a second and talk about Creed's Human Clay. I loved Creed, and I still think that Creed is really unfairly chastised for being this melodramatic butt rock band where Scott Stapp was just doing this. People kind of throw them in with like Nickelback. Creed was, if nothing else, a very spiritual, angsty band that was trying to figure out what are the stakes of life. Should I be there on a Sunday morning banging my head? Am I stuck in my own prison? Who do I want to be? Is there a heaven? Can you take me higher? You know, there's all these kind of deep questions that people have asked since the beginning of time. And for all of my middle school years, when all of your emotions are so heightened, everything feels so black and white and melodramatic, Creed answered that for me. Like, I really liked Creed. I really liked even Evanescence and Linkin Park. And I stand by those first three Creed albums, My Own Prison and Human Clay and Weathered. I freaking loved all those. When I was putting this list together, the next place my mind went was to my time in New York City, because that was another really formative time, much like college. You know, I was as an adult for the first time on my own. I had my dream job at Entertainment Weekly, which wasn't ultimately my dream job. And the album that reminded me the most of that time was Red by Taylor Swift.
I knew you were trouble when you walked in.
Red is still my favorite Taylor Swift album. There's something that just feels kind of messy about it. She obviously had kind of taken over the country music world, and now she was pivoting into a new direction. And I think the way that this album shaped my music taste is that it made me own the fact that I really respect Taylor Swift as a songwriter, because it's really easy to play a role of just rolling your eyes at Taylor Swift in country music conversations and saying that girl needs to go pop. And on this album, she was going pop, but she was still calling herself country. It was confusing, and yet this was the moment I really had to own. I think she's an incredible songwriter. I think All Too Well might be one of the best songs of my lifetime. Plus, I just ran to this album a ton. I lost a bunch of weight when I first moved to New York. I go up and down in weight all the time. And I Knew You Were Trouble was one of the main songs I listened to. But yeah, this made me really start to take her more seriously as one of the voices of music of this generation. And as I've said many times, I have a lot of respect for how Taylor Swift handled her exit from country music, really out of respect to the genre. Then I've got the self-titled debut album from the Lone Bello.
You never need nobody.
This album is on the list, A, because I love it, but B, because it represents the era of life where I discovered I loved the live music experience. I actually wasn't a huge concert goer for most of my life, but it wasn't until I lived in New York and I would go out on the Lower East Side to Rockwood Music Hall and see this new band, the Lone Bello, play live and just tear the house down with their incredible harmonies and their just sort of magnetic stage presence. These guys lived in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, so I ended up becoming friends with them, but I had heard these songs dozens of times before I ever heard them on this album. I remember this album got kickstarted, and there was a line in the Kickstarter video that said, "Help us capture thunder in a shoebox." And damn, that's what this album is to me. It's like dramatic and real, but also homespun and beautiful, and it just reminds me of being, I don't know, 23 in New York City. I love it. Then we got Mr. Misunderstood by Eric Church. This album was supposed to be this shocking surprise release, but it kind of got buried under the news of Chris Stapleton arriving on the scene at the CMA Awards, and it didn't get as much press on its first day as it should have, and that always will bum me out because I think this is the moment in my mind where Eric Church went from being really good to being a living legend. This was the album where all of his outlaw attitude got kind of spun forward into him being a dad and him kind of evolving into a more mature songwriter. I think one of the most satisfying things about being a fan of artists is watching that progression, and it's absolutely there with Eric Church. I freaking love Mr. Misunderstood. Knives of New Orleans, one of my favorite songs ever. Then I got a trifecta of albums that I'm going to call my unemployment albums, which is when I left Entertainment Weekly, I traveled all over the world and was trying to figure out what my next move was before I came down to Virginia. And I listened to a bunch of classic music. I had never really been interested in older music from before my time, but I found myself looking backwards specifically at 3 albums. Joni Mitchell's Blue, and I listened to A Case of You a million times. Patty Griffin's Children Running Through, when I listened to Oh Heavenly Day and Burgundy Shoes so many times in a row. And then Paul Simon's Graceland. And Paul Simon's Graceland, I went to South Africa that year, and that also kind of elevated the whole experience if you know any of the backstory of that album. I think some people grow up really liking oldies from their parents, but it wasn't until I was like 24, 25 that I really ever took the time to look backwards before my time. And then finally I want to talk about 21 Pilots' Vessel.
And the windowsill looks really nice, right? You think twice about your life, it probably happens at night, right?
My little sister Kitty turned me on to 21 Pilots before they were ever big, before Stressed Out was ever even a hit. She was like, I love this band, I want to go see them in concert. My mom asked if I would be her chaperone because my parents had no interest in going. I think Tyler Joseph is a brilliant, brilliant songwriter. He is shockingly honest, and he's wrestling with faith and identity and suicide and depression and guns and just so much stuff, and it's all captured on Vessel gorgeously. And the reason I'm saying this shaped my taste is because I think it really tipped me off to the reality, and I'd say it's a reality that teenagers, and maybe even more specifically teenage girls, can sometimes hear something fresh and different and appealing in music at like some kind of frequency that I don't hear, but they're attuned to. And that's definitely how I felt with 21 Pilots, because like I saw them in a small crowd of like 700 people with her, and then literally less than a year later they were selling out arena. Now I'm kind of running out of time here, but other albums that I kind of wanted to mention but I'm not going to talk much about are The Adventures of Bobby Ray by B.O.B. I saw him in concert in college, and I liked some of the songwriting on that album, like Letters to Vietnam. I loved Florence and the Machine's Ceremonials. Newer stuff like Heartache Medication by John Party. Honestly, Hootie and the Blowfish Greatest Hits. There's a bunch, I can't mention them all, but that's just a little slice of my music taste and some of the albums that have definitely helped shift my perspective, shape me as a music fan. I'd love to know some of yours. You can leave those in the comments down below. I'm working on something really big, so if there's less videos in the next couple weeks, it's just because I'm working on one that I think is awesome. So stay tuned. I'll see you guys very soon with a bunch more music.